What is photosynthesis? So we talk about photosynthesis as a process that occurs in plants. This is great, but we also need to think about how it actually occurs in the environment and what effect that might have on the surrounding organisms, other plants in the environment, and the ecosystem itself. So in this series we think about photosynthesis as a process. We think about photosynthesis as far as the structures involved within the plants, and we'll think about photosynthesis from an application standpoint, looking at the idea of how photosynthetic rates may change in different climates and for different plant types. So the first thing I want you to think about is name something you eat that isn't from a plant or from an animal that ate a plant. Your first thought might be something like a crayon, but crayon is actually based in wax, which is based in plant byproducts. So guess again. Well, you could think about something like dirt, if you're a kid, or now, but again, contains all kinds of plant material. So guess again. Typically, we can think about things like ice. Sure, it's water, but we'll also look at the fact that plants generate some amount of water. So is that truly not from a plant? Then you can think about things like minerals. Okay, maybe you've got me there. We can think about salts and things that we harvest from the environment that technically are not made by plants, but remember, many of them are used by plants, so they might be recycled by plants. We'll keep this in mind as we think through things. So who is it that's actually photosynthesizing? Well, sure, you can think about pine trees and maple trees and flowers and grass, but we also have to think about the fact that most of our photosynthesis actually comes from very, very, very tiny plants, typically in the oceans. So things like algae and prokaryotes will be organisms that we look at in more detail later, but we have to keep them in mind as photosynthetic contributors because many of them are contributing very high levels of photosynthesis and in turn contributing very high levels of oxygen to our environment. We need to keep that in mind. So the process of photosynthesis of itself is to convert light energy into chemical energy. Basically speaking, we're looking at turning sunshine into sugar. So we need to think in that process how we actually are going to use that sunlight not as a reactant in our process, but we're going to use it as a mechanism by which we are going to put reactants together. So our reactants in our equation are actually going to be carbon dioxide and water. So if we look at carbon dioxide and water as our primary reactants, what are we going to produce? Well, I told you, sugar, right? Do you remember the equation for sugar? In particular, we're looking for the equation for glucose. Do you remember what that was? Right? So, if we're dealing with the production of glucose in our plants from carbon dioxide and water to make C6H12O6, and we're also going to produce oxygen. And, like I said, we will have some byproduct of water as well. How do we get to this point? Well, if you're going to go through the reaction steps, which we'll do later on, you'll see that this is going to require a very high amount of energy. Remember, we're putting things together. We're building something. You have to put energy in. So, like I said, we're going to think through the basics of photosynthesis. We're going to think through how these reactions actually occur and the conversion of solar energy into chemical energy, and then we're going to think about how we actually take that carbon dioxide and reduce it into a sugar. Okay, so what we want to think about is, what does reducing CO2 actually mean? This is going to take us back to some biochemistry, and we'll talk about this in a little while.